As we climbed the stairs with our parents to the meeting in Superintendent Blossom's office, it was clear that we all had one thing on our minds, that school officials provide a concrete plan to stop the abuse by Central High's hardcore segregationist students. "I'm angry enough to hunt bear without my shotgun," said one of the fathers. "These folks had best do something really big to show me they want to make this integration work. I'm tired of them counting on us to make all the sacrifices," said another parent. "We need to know what they're willing to sacrifice." 30 minutes into that meeting, neither Blossom nor any of his people had addressed the issue we had told him we were anxious to discuss. Instead, all the school officials present were giving us the same song and dance about our not responding to our attackers in order to maintain peace. They were lecturing us on the proper attitude and the responsibility of our parents. There were no words from them about how they were going to take any responsibility for keeping students from abusing us. "Excuse me," Mother Lois said, suddenly rising to her feet, interrupting Superintendent Blossom mid-sentence. I was frightened to see her standing there so tiny, wringing her hands nervously. "What I want to know is whether or not you have any specific plans for protecting our children." "That's none of your business," Blossom replied in a rude tone. "Oh, I'd say it's very much my business." Mother's words came rapid fire. Still he ignored her, continuing his rhetoric as before. Silence fell over the room. She interrupted him. "Once you will protect as parents, we have a right to know how our children." He gave her neither an answer nor any acknowledgement that she had a right to ask such a question. More. Instead, he continued his meaningless comments, ignoring her as she stood there for several minutes expecting him to answer her. Finally, she took her seat. Her face was red with anger and embarrassment. I felt that by disrespecting Mother that way, the superintendent was disrespecting all of us seated in that room. I was very angry with the others, especially the fathers, who did not stand up and defend my mother. The humiliation and fear I felt so upset me that I couldn't consider anything that was said during the remainder of the meeting. Nevertheless, it was clear by the time we left for home that nothing had been resolved. 9 Negro students enter Central at different door. Arkansas Gazette, October 31st, 1957. On Wednesday, with no sign of our military escorts, we decided to avoid the hecklers who were starting to greet us each morning. We arrived early and entered the 14th and Park Street entrance, a block to the right of the front entry. We had determined that going in the front door presented more risks than it was worth. The repeated recitation by Governor Faubus that our voluntary withdrawal and the departure of all troops was the only way to bring peace was reflected by a change in the students' attitudes. It was as though they counted on our getting kicked out at any moment. Those few who had earlier tried to reach out had obviously been pressured to turn away. One girl who happened to meet me alone in a restroom said that she and the other moderate white students were being harassed with telephone threats and were being ostracized. It was evident that school officials and teachers were under more and more pressure from segregationists to help them get rid of us. For me, the most frightening events at school were the increased number of pep rallies and assemblies that came with the football season and the beginning of the holidays. At those times, I was surrounded by a sea of hostile faces and a chorus of hurtful words. There weren't enough teachers or guards on earth to corral the out-of-control students. We came to refer to the auditorium as the torture chamber. I had grown to expect being elbowed, poked, and kicked, to have my hair pulled, to be punched in the back or trampled as I was entering or leaving the auditorium. But having glue doused on the back of my neck and in my ponytail was more unpleasant. I was at first paralyzed by the terror I felt when during one assembly a boy thrust a knife at me. As I sat in a shadowy corner beneath the balcony overhang, he placed the blade against the right side of my face and whispered obscene threats. I surprised myself by biting down hard on his wrist, and then springing up out of my seat to find a teacher. But she wouldn't listen to my complaint. "Both of you sit down right now. You're disturbing the others," she hissed, directing me back to my seat and returning her attention to the stage. No sooner had she turned to leave when out of the corner of my eye, I saw the flash of the steel blade as the boy thrust it at me once again. Only this time he gripped me even tighter. I felt the sharp blade shave the side of my cheek. No matter how I struggled, I couldn't break his hold. Once again, I bit down as hard as I could into his forearm, drawing blood. He quickly pulled back his arm, muffling his outcry. "A rabies shot. I'll need a rabies shot now," he growled at me. The teacher listened impatiently to my second report and then said, "These children have tolerated a lot of upheaval." Even though she ignored me, I felt better, because at least I wasn't a whining wimp anymore. Alderman orders arrest of NAACP officials. Arkansas Gazette, November 1st, 1957. The adults we counted on were showing ever more stress. Mrs. Bates's newspaper was being strangled economically. At the same time, she and other NAACP officials across the state were under increased pressure from State Attorney General Bruce Bennett to turn over all records, including names, addresses, and phone numbers of members and contributors to the organization. Bennett had, a few months before in August, filed a civil suit against the NAACP, saying the organization had been doing business in Arkansas for 7 years, although it had only recently registered as a foreign corporation. He had early on begun to badger Mrs. Bates for information about all the members and contributors of the state's 27 branches. It frightened us to see our allies being abused. In my diary I wrote, "What will become of us if the NAACP is not strong? It feels as though segregationists are attacking from all sides. They know very well we count on Mrs. Bates and the local NAACP people, as well as Mr. Marshall, if they're busy defending themselves, who will see after us." During those first days of November, we found ourselves coping with yet another crisis brought on by insensitive Central high school officials. The tiger was their school mascot, and the tiger directory was a list of all the students' names, addresses, and telephone numbers. Despite our requests that our names and numbers not be listed, and despite the fact that school CLs had overwhelming evidence that our lives were in jeopardy, our information was nevertheless included. Yes, newspapers had printed the information before, but they had stopped. This new release summoned into action passive students who might up until then have thought twice about calling us. So of course we got more and more phone calls. Whether they were threats and vicious language, or mere hang-ups, those calls took our time and energy. I continued to yearn for the return of the 101st full time. We were told that a couple of hundred soldiers remained at nearby Camp Robinson. Somehow, I figured that maybe Since things were so bad, they would come back to be with us every day, guarding us up close as they had in the beginning, but it wasn't happening. The next time I saw Danny, he said he didn't think they would return on a regular basis because the powers that be wanted us to stand alone. Those times when we were lucky enough to get our 101st guards were wonderful. We treasured their presence, as infrequent as it had become. Sometimes we were guarded by the Arkansas National Slobs, as we called the federalized soldiers, who, by then, had shown us in every way that they loathed the responsibility and didn't take it seriously. They had become visibly hostile toward us, sometimes whispering threats and taunting and teasing us when they got us alone. Segregationists were publicly urging them to abandon their duty stations rather than guard us. On one of the first days of November, Minajan arrived at my house after school to show me Life magazine. It had a full-page picture of my back in it. There I was, ponytail and all, saluting the flag. It wasn't the first time we'd seen ourselves in print or on television, but we giggled at the wonder of it all. Miss Minajan and Miss Melba could now be seen on the pages of Life, Look, or the New York Times. We did, however, begin to notice there was a price to be paid whenever we appeared in periodicals or on television. The next day, the harassment inside Central would always increase. As Minajan and I spent time together that evening, I could tell she was beginning to be deeply affected by what was being done to her at Central High. She seemed especially vulnerable to the isolation we were all struggling to cope with. She had decided she would be accepted by white students if she could just show them how beautifully she sang. She was almost obsessed with finding an opportunity to perform her music on stage. She said she was definitely going to participate in a school program and had in fact already made inquiries about it. Little did we know that even while we were discussing her performing in school programs, the Central High Mothers League was preparing to make a bigger fuss than ever before to exclude her. With each passing day, the furor about her wanting to participate was building, but their threats did not stop Minajan. She was already waging yet another campaign to sing on stage. This time it was to sing Tammy in the talent show. It was as though these objections fueled her need to do what wasn't wanted. I wondered whether or not she had considered that the audience would boo her off the stage. Did she figure they would be enraptured by her performance? I shuddered at the thought of what the students would say or do to her if she made it. But I could tell that her anxiety over the constant abuse we endured and sadness over being left out was clouding her view. She delighted in planning for the performance, announcing and displaying a joyful glee about the possibility of singing in front of white kids. When I talked to Ernie about my concerns, he brushed them aside. As usual, he was taking the situation in stride. Even when he was punched with punishing blows or was kicked to the floor, he kept a positive attitude. I liked his attitude, even when I didn't agree with his view. Like me, Thelma was very concerned about Minajan. We talked about how we could convince her to stop pushing to participate. Each of us was hearing increasingly negative responses to her desire to do so. It was clear to us that both students and outsiders would take the opportunity to make a huge issue of her request. Terry was philosophical about it. Let her try and she'll learn her lesson, once and for all. I could see Terry becoming more fatalistic about our predicament. His hopes that we could change people's minds were visibly reduced. He was nervous, not as cheerful, not humming his funny tunes. Stress was beginning to tell on Gloria, too. She was clamming up, becoming solemn. I could almost see her mind working to try to set things right so she could keep going in her meticulous way. Elizabeth had never fully regained her composure following her awful encounter with the mob. Continued harassment was also taking its toll of her. She reacted by becoming silent and withdrawn. When I discussed Minajan's predicament with Elizabeth, she appeared alarmed and agreed that we ought not attract unnecessary attention to ourselves. Carlotta strained to keep smiling. Although she often took a lot of heat, especially in gym class, she tried to make the best of it, as did Jeff. Like the two other boys, Jeff was taking a lot of brutal physical punishment. He was quick on his feet, but he often got trapped in gym class or in corners of the hall, where he was kicked and punched. Whenever we compared notes, we all agreed. The students' attitudes had become polarized. We felt it would be best for Minajan to back off, but none of us could talk her out of it. She was adamant. The more we pleaded, the more determined she seemed to become. Only during fleeting moments did I allow myself to have fantasies of what it might be like to sing with the chorus or perform in the Thanksgiving program. My hopes of being a part of normal activities had long since faded. I refused to set myself up for disappointment. I simply wanted to make it through the year alive and uninjured. I resigned myself to devoting all my energy to that goal. I was surprised when I was invited to speak to the students who attended chapel, a fairly safe corner of the school. It had been the one place where I had found brief moments of peace. On those days when I arrived early enough to go there, I nized over the invitation, but finally Grandma made it easy for me. This is your opportunity to witness. But what if they throw things in the house of the Lord? Surely not. These white folks aren't heathens. While you speak, they will come to understand you are all worshiping the same Lord. So I prepared my talk, but I kept my invitation to myself. I didn't want to hurt Minajan's feelings, given the heroic effort she was making to convince school officials to allow her to sing on stage. Army has orders to remove troops of Senate school. Arkansas Gazette, November 19, 1957. The Senate airborne troops were going back to Kentucky. My heart pounded as I raced through the article that told how Major General Edwin Walker, head of the Arkansas Military District, would head the force of about 225 men from the Arkansas National Guard. They would take full responsibility for enforcing the court order. In other words, we would now have to rely solely on them to keep us safe and alive. I sat paralyzed on the living room couch reading the article aloud once more as Grandma was organizing the family to prepare for our traditional Thanksgiving celebration. I consoled myself with the fact that there was no specific departure date for the 101st. Maybe they meant after the first of the year. I would go on hoping that article was mistaken. Surely they couldn't really be leaving. Put that paper down, girl. It's time. We had begun our holiday ritual. Grandma was desperately trying to wrestle Conrad's old train set away from him to give to the poor. Thanksgiving, son. That's time to our count blessings. We've got to give deep this year because those benevolent white people who gave to our folks in years past are holding out on us to make us give up the integration. White charity groups were breaking traditions by taking away their Thanksgiving gifts and threatening to take away Christmas as well. To make matters more difficult, they were taking away as many jobs from my people as they could and cutting credit at the local stores. It was our tradition each year to sort through our toys and clothing at Thanksgiving and give away all the things we didn't need or use, as well as 2 things dear to us that we would especially like to keep. Conrad, have you got that train boxed yet? Not yet, Grandma. When? Conrad. Mother said as she dried the dinner dishes and handed them to me to put away. She and Grandma had been trying all day to get Conrad to see things their way. Melba's giving away her favorite blouse, Grandma said, and she's donating her favorite court skirt and a pair of shoes. She glanced at Conrad to see whether or not her prodding was affecting his stingy attitude. Melba likes suffering and doing without. That's why she goes to Central. But why do I have to? Where did you get a notion like that about your sister? Clark said that's what his folks say because sis stays in that white school being mistreated every day. Her staying there means she has made a promise that she intends to keep because she told God she would and she doesn't want to let herself and God down, Mother Lois said, walking over to look Conrad in the eye. So you must explain that to Clark the next time he inquires about your sister's motives. Yes, ma'am, but I'm not giving up the train. It's mine. Let's get down to basics, boy. If you don't ante up, you won't get any Thanksgiving dinner, and nobody will play Monopoly with you for a full week. Conrad's eyes got large, and his forehead wrinkled as he let go of the train's engine, and Grandma placed it in the gift box with our other contributions. U.S. officials drop plans to prosecute agitators at school. Won't press action against mob leaders. Arkansas Gazette, November 21st, 1957. Based on an assurance by local authorities that they would maintain order, the federal government announced it would back off and not even prosecute segregationist mob leaders. The segregationists' leaders were celebrating their victories, and the students at school were letting us know about their triumph. At the same time, Governor Fulbus was saying in print and on the air that the withdrawal of federal troops is distasteful because the Arkansas Guard will be left with the distasteful task of enforcing the integration. He said he would not take any state police forces or National Guardsmen to transport anybody to school or guard them while they were there. For Arkansas Guardsmen to do what the federal government ordered would be unfair because they didn't enlist to enforce integration, but to defend their country in a time of need. At school that day, Minijan and I talked about how frightened we were because, even though the harassment was getting worse, we were seeing fewer and fewer uniformed guards of any description. There were always rumors about FBI men being all over the place. Sure enough, we would occasionally see men who fit our fantasies of what FBI men should look like, but they never stopped to help us. To add to our distress, on that same day 2 state courts demanded that the NAACP's records be made public, and 6 men who were arrested for rioting during our first days at Central High School were cleared of all charges. On November 23, an article described how Judge Harry Robinson suspended fines of 2 men found guilty of rioting. And even as our problems with segregationists multiplied yet again, Minna Jane focused on her audition for the Glee Club and Christmas show. She had worked herself up into a real dither. Time and time again, Thelma and I had tried to talk her out of participating, but she wouldn't listen. Moments before the tryouts got underway, I stood in the doorway of the auditorium, nervously wringing my hands as Minna Jane tried to register. Mrs. Huckabee wore a pleasant smile as she explained to Minna Jane that the day to register for the tryouts had long since passed, and they couldn't violate the rules for her. We knew at once that she had been tricked. Had school officials been sincere about offering Minna Jane the opportunity, they would have been clear about the terms for participating. Blinking back tears, Minna Jane turned to us, then walked away. Thelma and I trailed behind, trying our best to console her. Teachers, students say, Central High seethes with undercurrents. Arkansas Gazette, November 24, 1957. 6 reporters had been dispatched to talk to anyone connected with the school. What they found was what we already knew. As the reporters said, it was a time of tension and testing. There was widespread talk of gangs dedicated to making trouble for us when the troops left. Those interviewed said they already made as much trouble for us as they could. However, we were described as students who studied and moved about most of the time in almost total isolation from our 2,000 white classmates. Because the whites who once tried to befriend us had been intimidated, either by social ostracism or by threats. Reading the article made me shudder, but it also helped me know we weren't imagining things. It was indeed getting more and more difficult to survive inside Central. We now had it confirmed from the most reliable source, hardcore segregationists themselves, and as far as I could tell, there was absolutely nothing we could do about it. On Monday, November 25, I prepared myself to speak to 250 students gathered for Central High's early morning chapel service. As I walked toward the front of the room and faced those white students, all staring at me, my knees felt weak and the back of my neck was tight. I stood at a podium in a room filled with people who didn't relish my speaking to them. Taking a deep breath, I began the talk I had practiced in front of the mirror and in front of Grandma and Mama. The light from the window at the back of the room was my focus. Mother Lois had said never to look any single member of the audience in the eye when you're speaking. At first, I garbled some of the words, and then, as I remembered Grandma India's advice, I calmed down. She had said, God's speaking. You're merely the instrument he chooses at this time. God is a wonderful speaker, so you have absolutely nothing to be nervous about. I didn't speak about integration or say things about us or Themi, just talked about God and how he cares for each of us. At first I could tell by the students' expressions that they didn't like what I was saying. Some frowned while others contorted their faces to show their contempt. Many had perfectly blank looks, but a few listened intently and nodded their heads in agreement. Afterward, 2 people came up to congratulate me and ask why I had a northern accent and used such correct English. Northern accent. Did they really ask you about that? Mother Lois grinned as I described my speaking. You tell them your mama's an English teacher, and in this house we speak only the King's English. We were discussing my day, sitting in our robes at the dining room table, after dinner and baths, playing Monopoly. The house was festive, and we were surrounded by the aroma of mincemeat and sweet potato pies cooking in the oven. Any flying objects? Actually, some of them were very nice. You were right, Grandma. She didn't look up. She was preoccupied with examining her next move on the board. We were already resigned to the fact that she would skunk us all once again. Right. How so? she mumbled, not taking her attention off the game for even one instant. Well, for just that moment, I felt we had something in common, our love of the Lord. I think they felt it, too, because some of them smiled and spoke to me. Someday they'll have the courage to be nice to you outside that room of worship. I don't think so, Grandma, because they would have to take so much criticism from their friends and families. This year is different. It won't always be this way. She rolled the dice, bought the last available property, and once again we'd all been trounced by our sweet grandma, the Monopoly champ. When Mrs. Bates telephoned to say the 9 of us would be gathering for an official Thanksgiving dinner to be held at her house Tuesday evening, before the holiday, she mentioned that there would be a news conference. I cringed at the thought. Whenever there was special press coverage on us, the abuse we later suffered at Central was in direct proportion to the size and quality of the story printed or aired. When Mother and I arrived at Mrs. Bates's home for the Thanksgiving dinner, I knew even more people than usual were there, because we couldn't find a place to park. When I entered the spacious living room, there was standing room only. I had never seen so many people, most of them reporters, squeezed into that space under hot glaring lights. At the center of the room, some of the other 9 students, dressed in Sunday best, were sitting at a table set with the same care Grandma used on holidays. Linen, and lace and silver, and a beautifully prepared bird. Mrs. Bates directed me to a seat, and I squeezed past Jeff and Gloria to get to my place. Even more reporters with more cameras and equipment packed into the room as we tried to give the impression of having a normal meal. Some of the others were reviewing speeches they had prepared. I hadn't prepared anything, because by now the art of giving an interview was second nature, or at least that's what I thought. Once the cameras were rolling and the microphones recording, the questions began to fly. When Mrs. Bates asked, "Do you kids want white meat or dark meat?" I spoke without thinking. This is an integrated turkey. The annoyed expression on her face matched the one on Mother's, letting me know that maybe I should have prepared a speech. The reporters began snickering as they posed a series of questions on turkeys and integration, calling on me by name to answer. My palms began sweating, and my mouth turned dry. I hadn't meant to put my foot in my mouth. I didn't want the others to think I was trying to steal the spotlight. But once I had spoken out of turn, integrated turkey became the theme. "You'll live to regret that statement, Melba," Mother said as we were driving home. I knew she was agonizing over the consequences of my frivolity. She was right. I would suffer. There came a day just before Thanksgiving break, when Danny broke the rules again and came close up to talk to me. He wouldn't say whether or not he was leaving for good, but he behaved in a strange way, saying over and over again, "Take care of yourself. You hear me? Don't bend over to pick up any books or walk in dark corners." He winked and smiled as he backed away, giving me a military salute. I stood frozen in my tracks, holding back the tears. Over and over again, I asked him if he were going away for good, but he wouldn't tell me. "Just mind your P's and Q's." He turned on his heels. I couldn't admit to myself it was really true. I turned away and ran in the opposite direction, never looking back, never turning to let him see the tears in my eyes. From that moment on, whenever I thought about Danny and the 101st being gone for good, I pushed the idea out of my mind because I couldn't bear to deal with it. I just had to pretend it wasn't so, even though some part of me kept saying I truly had. To fend for myself now. My real Thanksgiving at home was a special day of peace and joy. It was wonderful being with all my relatives, and I was able to convince them not to talk about Central High. For just that day, I felt normal, and I hoped that my life could be that way soon. I came face to face with reality later that evening as one read the Gazette headlines. Last of 225 JIs leave school. A RKANSASNATION, a L guard in charge. The article said, the 101st troops had left the day before. Thanksgiving night, I wrote in my diary, "Danny and the others have truly gone. He didn't even say goodbye. I will always remember this man. How could I forget his name? I will never know if he only behaved that kindly because he was a great soldier or a good person or both. It doesn't matter. He was wonderful. I want to remember the names of the other nice and soldiers as well, Jody, Marty, Mex, and Goggles. I wish Danny had told me he was leaving forever. Although I don't know how I could have thanked him in words. I might have cried, and he wouldn't have liked that. I never thought I would have tears in my eyes over some white man. I don't think I'll ever see him again. Thank you, Danny." On Friday, November 29, the Gazette headline brought more bad news, especially for Minigian. MOTHERS League head protests NEGRO's part. In SHS talent program. The Mothers League of Central High School has issued a protest on behalf of their organization against a Negro girl's participation in a talent program sponsored by Central High School. The article went on to name Minigian Brown specifically and to say that we should not be allowed to participate in any extracurricular activities. That night, Grandmother added to my worry list. "President Eisenhower's had a slight stroke," she said. "We gotta pray for him quick. I knew the president was important in my life. If things got rough inside Central, I needed him to be alive and well, so he could send the troops back." Mother said we should send him a telegram of hope and prayer, and so we did. I spent much of the day agonizing over how much worse things could get on Monday, what with the papers printing my integrated turkey line and announcing the final departure of the 100